Welcome to this lecture on women after independent India, constitutional safeguards. The period after independence in 1947 marked a historic transformation for women's rights. For the first time, equality was not just an ideal but a constitutional promise. The Indian Constitution guaranteed equal rights, justice, and freedom to both men and women. This marked a shift from centuries old social struggle to a structured legal and political framework for equality. National leaders like Jawaharlal Nehru, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, and Rajkumari Amrit Kaur emphasized that democracy could not succeed without gender justice. The 1950s and 60s were years of institution building. New laws, policies, and welfare boards began shaping modern India's approach to women's empowerment. However, despite these achievements, deep rooted patriarchy and economic inequality persisted, particularly in rural and poor households. This lecture explores how constitutional safeguards, family law reforms, education, and labor policies created the legal foundation for women's equality between 1947 and the 1970s, setting the stage for the feminist awakening that followed in the next decades. After independence, India faced immense challenges: poverty, illiteracy, and the need to rebuild a democratic society. We have to simultaneously take up the task of both state building as well as nation building. Women who had actively participated in the freedom struggle were now expected to help shape the nation's future. The new constitution sought to correct centuries of discrimination through law and social reform. National planning under Nehru prioritized education, health, and employment for women. Yet, cultural traditions and unequal social structures continued to restrict progress. Early legislation on marriage, property, and labor reflected a desire to balance tradition with modernization. Global influences like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948 also inspired Indian policymakers. Thus, the post independence era represented a moment of transition where the ideals of equality met the realities of social conservatism. The next 2 decades would test whether legal reforms could genuinely improve women's everyday lives. The Constitution of India 1950 was a turning point in women's history. It declared equality before law under Article 14, prohibited discrimination on the grounds of sex under Article 15, and guaranteed equal opportunities in employment under Article 16. Article 39 directed the state to ensure equal pay for equal work, while Article 42 provided for maternity relief and humane working conditions. These provisions made gender equality a constitutional obligation, not a charity. The framers of the Constitution understood that democracy without equality would be incomplete. By recognizing women as citizens with full political, social, and legal rights, India became one of the first post colonial nation to embed feminism into its founding document. These safeguards gave women the legal tools to challenge discrimination, marking the beginning of India's long journey towards true social justice. Women in the Constituent Assembly played a crucial role in shaping constitutional principles of equality. Leaders like Hansa Mehta, Rajkumari Amrit Kaur, Durgabai Deshmukh, and Renuka Ray made powerful interventions to ensure gender sensitive language and guarantees. Hansa Mehta's contribution to the phrase all human beings are born free and equal in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights echoed in India's constitution. Amrit Kaur argued for women's representation in administration, and health. Durgabai Deshmukh emphasized education as a key to empowerment. The Assembly's discussions reveal that gender justice was central to the vision of our democratic India. Women were not passive recipients of rights, they were active framers of them. Their legacy ensured that equality became a permanent moral and legal foundation for independent India. The fundamental rights section became the backbone of women's legal protection. It guaranteed freedom of speech, movement, and profession, opening doors previously closed by social custom. Article 23 outlawed human trafficking and forced labor, protecting women from exploitation. Article 24 prohibited child labor, indirectly benefiting young girls forced into work. Together, these rights made equality enforceable by courts. The addition of fundamental duties later reinforced the moral responsibility of citizens to reject degrading practices against women. However, despite constitutional guarantees, actual enforcement remained slow due to lack of awareness and resources. Still, the existence of legal equality changed public attitudes. For the first time, Indian women could claim citizenship, not just protection. This shift from dependency to rights based identity defined the new republic's vision for gender justice. The DPSPs and women, the DPSPs, though non binding, provided a moral and social guide to the government. They emphasized equal pay for equal work, protection of maternity, and education for all children. These principles inspired numerous social welfare policies during the 1950s and 60s. They reflected Nehru's belief that political democracy must be accompanied by social and economic democracy. Article 42's provision for maternity relief and humane work conditions led to labor and health reforms. Article 39 encouraged the state to ensure a fair distribution of resources and equal opportunity. The DPSPs gave India a unique framework linking constitutional ideals with public policy. Even though they were not enforceable in court, they became a yardstick for judging the government's commitment to women's welfare. One of the greatest achievements of independent India was universal adult franchise. Unlike many Western democracies, India granted women the right to vote from the very first general election in 1951-52. This decision symbolized a complete political equality and broke with centuries of exclusion. Women participated enthusiastically as voters, candidates, and campaigners. The right to vote empowered them to influence legislation, shape public policy, and hold leaders accountable. Political participation also challenged stereotypes of women as passive dependents. Women's equal suffrage made India's democracy inclusive from its inception. However, representation remained low, and political parties were slow to promote female candidates. Nevertheless, the franchise gave women constitutional visibility, marking a significant step towards inclusive governance and participatory democracy. The post independence period saw several remarkable women in leadership roles. Rajkumari Amrit Kaur became India's first health minister, establishing the aims in New Delhi. Durgabai Deshmukh led to the Central Social Welfare Board, coordinating women's education and welfare programs. Hansa Mehta represented India at the United Nations and advocated global gender equality. Vijayalakshmi Pandit became the first women president of the UN General Assembly. These leaders embodied the values of service and equality that had driven the freedom movement. Their success proved that women could contribute effectively to administration, diplomacy, and policy making. They paved the way for the rise of Indira Gandhi, who became India's first women prime minister in 1966. The leadership of these pioneers bridged the gap between reform and governance. Hindu Code Bill, drafted under B.R. Ambedkar's leadership, represented the boldest post independence legal reform for women. These laws modernized traditional Hindu personal laws by introducing divorce rights, inheritance equality, and adoption rights. The Hindu Marriage Act of 1955 and Hindu Succession Act of 1956 established women's legal autonomy within the family. Despite fierce opposition from conservatives, the government supported these reforms as essential to democracy. Ambedkar argued that political liberty was meaningless without social equality. The debates surrounding these bills reflected India's struggle to reconcile modernity with tradition. Their passage marked the first time women achieved legal recognition as, you can say, independent individuals rather than dependents of men. The Hindu Code Bills remain a milestone in India's legislative history. Post independence, family laws redefined marriage and women's rights within the household. The Hindu Marriage Act of 1955 made monogamy mandatory and recognized divorce on specific grounds. The Hindu Succession Act of 1956 granted women inheritance rights, ending centuries of exclusion. The Dowry Prohibition Act of 1961 criminalized dowry transactions, addressing economic exploitation. The Special Marriage Act of 1954 allowed intercaste and civil marriages, promoting secular equality. Guardianship and adoption reforms improved the legal status of mothers. These changes reflected a growing understanding that gender justice must begin at home. By transforming family law, India took a major step towards balancing legal and social equality for women. Employment and labor reforms. The early decades of independence saw progress in women's employment rights. The Constitution's provisions on equality and maternity protection were implemented through labor legislations. The Factories Act and Maternity Benefits Act improved working conditions and health safeguards. Public sector jobs opened for women, especially in teaching, nursing, and administration. Trade unions gradually recognized female workers' issues. However, women's employment remained concentrated in low paid sectors, and social stigma discouraged participation in certain jobs. Equal pay legislation and labor codes provided legal protection but required stronger enforcement. That was something missing. The post independence years laid the groundwork for future economic empowerment by linking labor justice with women's dignity. Despite all the changes, one can see very discriminatory service condition laws is still designed by the Indian legislature, like Recruitment and Promotion Services Act for the Indian Foreign Services that required women uh, IFS officers to seek permission before getting married, and they can be sacked anytime from their job on the grounds of efficiency, while there were no such rules or conditions for the male IFS officers. Moreover, the term efficiency was nowhere defined. As a result of this act, most of the Indian Foreign Services females who were joining Indian Foreign Services either resigned after marriage or remained unmarried. The provisions were challenged by C.B. Muthamma in late 1970s, and then it was scrapped. Similarly, there was job stereotyping, like Indian women was not allowed to join Indian defense services except as doctors and nurses. And thus, though constitution was guaranteeing equality in the matters of public employment, the laws were clearly not very much favoring women, and there were very discriminatory service conditions that was prevailing till the time they were challenged in the decade of 70s and 80s. Education became the government's primary tool for women's advancement, but not in the initial decades. It was only from the decade of 1970s when one can see lots of changes at the global level, enhancing consciousness towards gender equality and women rights. We were having world women conferences, and this was the decade, the 1970s, when Indian government was compelled to constitute a committee to study the status of women in India. And this committee on the status of women in India submitted its report in 1976 towards equality that declared women to be one of the most backward sections of the societies. So you see that in the decade of 1950s, the government was not really focusing much on women education and development, though on papers it was definitely there. Though there was improvement, like female literacy, that was only 8.9% in 1951, rose to nearly 30% by 1971. The Constitution directed free and compulsory education for children, and national plans expanded girls' schools and vocational centers, women's universities, teacher training institutes, and scholarships encouraged higher education. The Central Social Welfare Board launched programs for adult literacy and home science training. Education not only improved employment opportunities but also raised awareness about rights and health. By empowering women intellectually, India began dismantling the roots of inequality. Education became the cornerstone of post independent social change, but definitely or remarkably from the decades of 1970s. Women in politics and public life, you see that women's political participation after independence symbolized democracy in action. The first general elections saw several women elected to parliament and state legislatures. Leaders like Suchita Kriplani, Aruna Asaf Ali, and Vijayalakshmi Pandit continued their public services. Undoubtedly, one has to accept that the women leadership in the initial 2 decades of independence was again confined to the elite class, mainly English educated elite and those belonging to the erstwhile princely states or zamindar families or the elite class of India. However, gradually it trickled down to the lower levels also, and by you see that after say since the decade of 1970s and especially since the decade of 1990s, that we can see the participation of women rising tremendously. Local government bodies, of course, began to include female representatives, but at a minuscule scale. Their numbers were small and their influence was insignificant. Women also entered diplomacy, law, journalism, and education, but their presence in public life was not very significant, though it challenges stereotypes and inspired younger generations. However, representation remained uneven across regions and castes and classes. Still, the visibility of women in politics reinforced the constitutional promise of equality and paved the way for later reservation policies in local governance. Women's organizations played a key role in implementing reforms and monitoring welfare programs. The All India Women's Conference, formed earlier, continued advocacy for education and legal equality. The National Federation of Indian Women, 1954, worked on labor rights and peace issues. The Central Social Welfare Board coordinated Mahila Mandals for community development. International cooperation through the United Nations promoted awareness of women's issues. These organizations bridged government policy and grassroots actions, ensuring that constitutional rights reached ordinary citizens. They also prepared the ground for the second wave of women's movements in the 1970s and beyond, proving that activism and policy must go hand in hand. But the real change can be seen again, I would say, from the decade of 1970s. Despite legal progress, social inequalities persisted. Dowry, domestic violence, and child marriages continued in many areas. Economic dependence kept women vulnerable, especially in rural and lower caste communities. Widows and divorced women faced stigma and exclusion. Many families viewed education and employment for girls as secondary. The gap between law and social practice exposed the limitations of legal reforms without social welfare, or rather social awareness. The challenge was not lack of rights but lack of implementation, lack of awareness, and the absence of a pragmatic mindset. People were not ready to still change their mindset. The change that one can see during the national struggle for freedom is missing in independent India in the initial decades. The persistence of these issues would later speak feminist activism in the 1970s, calling for both state accountability and cultural change. The struggle for equality, therefore, was far from over. Independent India played a leading role in international women's rights efforts. Hansa Mehta represented India in drafting the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. India ratified United Nations and ILO conventions on labor and maternity protection. Delegates participated in global conferences that promoted equality, health, and education. The country's example of universal suffrage and constitutional equality inspired other newly independent nations. Global recognition reinforced India's commitment to women's development at home. The growing connection between national and international feminist discourse prepared India for future collaboration with the United Nations during the International Women's Decade from 1975 to 1985. The impact of all these was not a change in the status of women overnight, but they played an important role in creating consciousness towards women issues, and they sort of created a kind of awareness. They prepared the ground for future uh, feminist movements in India. Between 1947 and the 1970s, India built a strong legal and institutional foundation for women's equality. The constitution, family laws, education policies, and labor reforms together created the framework for justice. Women emerged as citizens with rights, responsibilities, and opportunities. Yet, legal equality did not immediately guarantee social transformation. The persistence of patriarchy, poverty, and discrimination revealed the complexity of progress. Still, this era marked an irreversible shift from reform to recognition, from dependence to citizenship. The next phase of women's history would focus on translating these rights into real empowerment. The story of post independence India proves that true freedom is achieved when equality becomes part of daily life and not just the law. Law is important, but there should be a simultaneous change of mind also to accept these legal changes and guarantee the exercise and free enjoyment of these legal provisions um, given to women as rights. Thank you.